Okay. I did my book on, I read Burn Before Reading, Presidents, CIA Directors, and Secret Agents by Stansfield Turner. And here's the book. And the book was published in October of 2005, and it has 12 chapters, and they're all labeled with important people's names on them, and who their CIA chiefs were during their time of presidency. So they're all based on like presidents and stuff like that. And looking at the contents and the titles, they have description of what they're going to talk about in that chapter, which I thought was pretty cool because it kind of gave you like a heads up, like, hey, this is what chapter 1 is going to talk about. This is what chapter 2 is going to talk about. So it talks from like FDR to George W. Bush and what happened during their presidency, things that people probably don't really know. And you kind of see the connections between the CIA chiefs and so much personal and political issues that interfered with the business in our nation cities during those times back then. And then you kind of see what happens now. I read this entire book, cover to cover, every word on every page. This book is very interesting to my eye. It very caught my eye because I'm all about true events and learning what really happened in different time and different history parts of it. So it kind of really helps you see the light of day, like what went on when we weren't born yet, and why we do things now versus why they did them back then. It talks about like the personalities of the people that were in power, and you kind of get a depth of like what they had to deal with and like who they had to help them with and stuff like that. It all had crazy events, and people were just interviewed that were there at the time. During the book, I read that wanted to see answers to studying each president's and their DCI relationships, and that how their decisions shaped our nations today for our future. So that's where this book kind of comes along. It talks about why what did FDR do back then versus what our next president did, which was Harry S. Truman. And then it kind of goes down the line of each president and talks about that. And it also gives you more the light of the day on like more of our CIA and all that kind of stuff, which I absolutely love. I get into the CIA kind of stuff. I don't know why, but it's very cool to me. So like chapter 1, like I said, it started with FDR and the Wild Bill, and it talks about the first Central Intelligence of America. Then you go to chapter 2, and you have Harry S. Truman and his people, and they talk about finding the CIA. And then chapter 3 was kind of Dwight D. Eisenhower and Allen Dulles, and they talk about the first CIA thrust in action and kind of see what they were kind of dealing with and everything. Then you got chapter 4 that talked about John F. Kennedy and the scandals and the confusion on their frontier and what they had to deal with. And then you've got chapter 5 is Lyndon Johnson. And it talks about the value and price of loyalty. So you kind of get more in depth of like, you kind of see the pattern. You start seeing that people were starting to grow up a little bit. But, it never really happens. So you got chapter 6 that Richard Nixon, and talks about the CIA despite. Then you got chapter 7. You got General Ford, Colby, George H.W. Bush. They talk about the CIA under a microscope, so they go kind of more in depth with it. Because, you really don't know a whole bunch about it. This kind of gives you a little more insight. Then you got chapter 8. Talks about Jimmy Carter and Turner and the DCI empowered. And then you've got chapter 9, which was Ronald Reagan, Casey, and Webster, and they were the it kind of goes back into the Wild Bill, which was FDR. They kind of go back to that. Chapter 10 is George H.W. Bush, Webster, and Gates, and it was the confession and compromise at the Cold War end. So you see the Cold War. You got chapter 11, which talks about the Bill Gates and the CIA without the Cold War. So you see kind of CIA without the Cold War. And then chapter 12, it brings up George W. Bush, 9/11, and it talks about what was going on right there. The most important thing for me was chapter 12, because I was in that era where 9/11 happened. I was only like in kindergarten or first grade, but I remember it. So reading all that kind of happen, you kind of see more of the insight with it. You kind of see the failures and what others tried to fix. They tried to fix the nation as much as they could. I recommend this book to anyone that loves history with the CIA. It's kind of good for that, which I'm always into that kind of stuff. So when reading this book, I honestly couldn't think of anything the first time, but reading more, you got people that are interviewing to get this information to write a book. So I thought it would be pretty cool to have maybe like 5th graders could interview like their grandparents, their parents, or other people that they might know. Maybe like limit it to like one person they interview that maybe has lived in one of these time zones, or I want to say time zones, but one of these centuries that we read about every day, and go in depth and ask them a series of questions that will be provided for them, and they do their own interview to that person, and then they bring that interview back to the school, and they make that person a booklet about that person's history, and they get to share. So it's kind of like they get to do their own interview, kind of make their own book about somebody that that got to live through part of history that we didn't, and then we get to kind of share more about that. So that was my book. It was pretty interesting, and thank you.